Imagine the flashpoint. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel fires water cannons at a Philippine supply boat near 2nd Thomas Shoal. Manila responds. Shots are fired. The question that follows is not just military. It is geopolitical. It reshapes every alliance, every trade route, and every strategic calculation across the Indo-Pacific. A China-Philippines conflict would not stay bilateral for long. The South China Sea carries roughly $3.4 trillion in annual trade. More than half of the world's maritime freight tonnage passes through these waters. Beneath them lie an estimated 125 billion barrels of oil and 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The sea is not a peripheral waterway. It is the economic circulatory system of the Asia-Pacific. China claims roughly 90% of the South China Sea through its so-called Nine-Dash Line, a claim the Permanent Court of Arbitration rejected in 2016, calling it incompatible with international law. Beijing ignored the ruling. Manila accepted it. That legal and strategic standoff has never been resolved. It has only intensified. The real question today is this: if armed conflict erupts between China and the Philippines, which countries would actually stand with Manila, and how far would they go? The answer starts in Washington. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines is the cornerstone of Manila's security architecture. Article 4 of the treaty commits both parties to act against armed attacks in the Pacific, including attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft in the South China Sea. In 2023, Secretary of State Antony Blinken reaffirmed that the treaty applies to the South China Sea. That was not a minor diplomatic footnote. It was a strategic signal to Beijing: attack the Philippines, and the United States will respond.
That's why we stand with the Philippines and stand by our ironclad defense commitments, including under the Mutual Defense Treaty. Article 4 extends to armed attacks on the Philippine armed forces, public vessels, aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea.
Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the United States now has access to 9 military bases in the Philippines, up from 5 in 2023. 4 of those bases are in Luzon, the island closest to Taiwan. That proximity matters enormously. The Philippines is not just a treaty ally, it is a strategic platform. In a conflict scenario, U.S. support would likely include intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, air and naval power projection, logistics and resupply operations, and potentially direct military intervention depending on the nature and scale of Chinese action. The United States would not enter lightly, but it would enter. As Admiral John Aquilino, former commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, stated plainly, "The threat is the most dangerous we've seen since World War II." Washington understands the stakes. The Philippines is not a peripheral concern. It is central to U.S. strategy in the Western Pacific. Japan would not send fighter jets to dogfight over the Spratly Islands. Its constitution and domestic politics make combat deployment politically untenable in the short term. But to dismiss Japan as a bystander would be a serious analytical error. Tokyo and Manila have deepened their defense ties substantially over the past 3 years. In 2024, Japan signed a reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, the first Japan has signed with a Southeast Asian country. Japanese Coast Guard vessels have conducted joint patrols with their Philippine counterparts. Tokyo has transferred radar systems, patrol vessels, and defense equipment under its official security assistance framework. Japan's strategic logic is straightforward and self-interested. China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea does not stop there. The same assertiveness that threatens Philippine sovereignty in the Spratlys also threatens Japan's southwestern island chain, including the Senkaku Islands. For Tokyo, the South China Sea is not someone else's problem. It is a preview of its own. In a conflict, Japan would almost certainly provide intelligence sharing, logistical support, radar and surveillance data, Coast Guard assets, and economic assistance to Manila. Diplomatically, Tokyo would work to internationalize the crisis, bring it to the United Nations Security Council, and mobilize G7 condemnation. That is not nothing. That is substantial strategic weight applied through non-combat means. Australia's strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific has shifted dramatically since 2021. The AUKUS partnership, bringing together Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, is a generational commitment to reshaping the regional balance of naval power. Canberra is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. It is deepening defense integration with Washington at every level. Australia has also expanded direct engagement with the Philippines. Joint maritime patrols, military exercises, and defense cooperation agreements have all increased. Canberra understands that a Chinese-controlled South China Sea would fundamentally compromise Australia's northern maritime approaches and its access to critical trade routes. In a conflict scenario, Australian support would likely be substantial. Naval deployments alongside U.S. forces, intelligence sharing through the Five Eyes network, air support, and logistics are all plausible contributions. Australia would not act unilaterally, but as part of a U.S.-led coalition, it would be among the most capable and committed participants. The Anzu Treaty also matters here. Under Article 4, an attack on the armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft of either party in the Pacific would trigger consultations and collective response. Australia's obligations are real, not merely rhetorical. South Korea presents a study in constrained partnership. Seoul is a significant arms exporter. Its KF-21 fighter and FA-50 light combat aircraft are actively marketed to Manila, and a country that understands Chinese coercion from its own experience. But South Korea has an existential problem sitting on its northern border. North Korea consumes Seoul's strategic bandwidth. Direct military deployment to the South China Sea is unlikely. Logistics, equipment, and intelligence support are more probable. Vietnam is the most interesting case in Southeast Asia. Hanoi has its own bitter territorial disputes with China, the Piracy Islands, the Spratlys, and a long history of Chinese aggression going back centuries. In 1974, China seized the Paracels by force from South Vietnam. In 1988, Chinese forces killed 64 Vietnamese sailors in a naval engagement at Johnson South Reef. The memory runs deep. Vietnam's four-nose policy, no military alliances, no foreign bases, no alignment with one country against another, no use or threat of force, formally constrains its options. But strategic autonomy and quiet balancing are not the same as passivity. Vietnam would likely share intelligence, coordinate diplomatically, and apply independent pressure on China in contested areas. It would not fight alongside Manila. But it would make Beijing's strategic calculus more complicated. Singapore punches far above its weight class militarily. Its armed forces are among the most capable in Southeast Asia. It hosts a substantial U.S. naval presence at Changi Naval Base, where American aircraft carriers routinely dock. But Singapore's foreign policy is built on a foundational principle: do not be forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. In a conflict, Singapore would provide indirect support, port access for U.S. and allied vessels, logistical facilitation, and quiet diplomatic engagement. It would not join combat operations. But strategic geography makes Singapore's cooperation important regardless of formal commitments. Indonesia is a different calculation entirely. Jakarta controls the Malacca Strait, the Lombok Strait, and the Sunda Strait, the three most critical maritime choke points connecting the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In 2019 and 2020, Indonesia deployed naval vessels to the North Natuna Sea after Chinese Coast Guard ships repeatedly intruded into its exclusive economic zone. Jakarta called them out directly, unlike many Asian members who avoid confrontation. But Indonesia is also Asia's largest economy, a self-proclaimed non-aligned power, and deeply reluctant to be drawn into great power competition. Its support in a conflict would be diplomatic and humanitarian, not military. Malaysia is similar. It has quiet South China Sea disputes of its own with China, but economic ties with Beijing constrain its public posture. India's role would be defined by strategic geography more than formal alliance. New Delhi is not a treaty ally of Manila. It has no obligation to fight. But India is a Quad partner, alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia, and it views Chinese maritime expansion through a lens shaped by its own ongoing border tensions with Beijing. The 2020 Galwan Valley clash, where Indian and Chinese soldiers fought in hand-to-hand combat along the line of actual control, sharpened Indian strategic thinking considerably. New Delhi has since accelerated defense cooperation across the Indo-Pacific, including arms sales to the Philippines. Manila has acquired BrahMos supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, a joint India-Russia development, which significantly enhances Philippine deterrence capability against Chinese naval assets. In a conflict scenario, India would likely maintain naval presence in the Indian Ocean to monitor and complicate Chinese logistics, provide diplomatic backing and intelligence, and deepen economic engagement with Manila. Direct intervention would remain off the table, but India's strategic shadow over the Indian Ocean, through which Chinese supply lines must pass, gives New Delhi considerable leverage without firing a single shot. Taiwan's position is the most paradoxical in this entire analysis. Taipei would almost certainly support Manila's cause intellectually, strategically, and perhaps through intelligence channels. Shared anxiety about Chinese military aggression creates natural alignment. Both Taiwan and the Philippines watch the same adversary conduct the same pattern of incremental coercion. But Taiwan cannot act openly. Its own survival is the first-order strategic priority. Any overt support from Manila would invite accelerated pressure from Beijing. Taiwan's contribution would remain in the shadows, intelligence sharing, diplomatic signaling, and the simple strategic fact that any Chinese military operation against the Philippines would risk exposing Taiwan to reduced Chinese surveillance and force attention. There is a harder point here. Taiwan's own situation informs how every actor in the region reads a China-Philippines conflict. If Beijing can coerce Manila into submission without triggering a meaningful allied response, the lesson for Taiwan, and for every country watching, is that the United States does not honor its commitments. The credibility of deterrence across the entire Indo-Pacific would be at stake. If a China-Philippines conflict materialized, the Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India would likely become the most important strategic coordination platform in the Indo-Pacific. Not a formal alliance. Not a military command structure, but a framework for intelligence fusion, diplomatic messaging, economic pressure, and strategic signaling. The Quad's value is precisely its informality. It creates coordination without the treaty obligations that might deter participation. Japan can contribute without deploying combat troops. India can signal without triggering its own confrontation with China. Australia and the United States can lead without appearing to act unilaterally. In 2023, Quad leaders issued a joint statement condemning destabilizing and coercive actions in the South China Sea, language that would acquire operational meaning in a conflict scenario. The Quad is not a paper tiger. It is a coalition in formation. Asian consensus in a conflict is essentially impossible. The bloc operates by unanimity. Cambodia and Laos, both deeply tied to Chinese investment, would block any collective condemnation. Thailand, a US treaty ally with limited recent engagement, would likely remain passive. Brunei has South China Sea claims, but tiny military capacity. But neutrality is not without strategic consequence. Every country that refuses to support China's narrative, even while staying militarily passive, contributes to Beijing's diplomatic isolation. The global majority does not support Chinese territorial claims. Even the Gulf states, even many of China's African partners, have not endorsed Beijing's 9-line position. Diplomatic isolation is a form of strategic cost. The economic stakes ensure that no country remains truly unaffected. A conflict in the South China Sea would disrupt semiconductor supply chains centered on Taiwan, throttle energy flows to Japan and South Korea, spike insurance costs for global shipping, and send commodity markets into crisis. Even countries sitting out the military dimension cannot escape the economic blast radius. Europe's role would be secondary, but not irrelevant. The United Kingdom, with its tilt to the Indo-Pacific and recent carrier strike group deployments in the region, has signaled genuine engagement. France maintains permanent military presence in the Indo-Pacific through its overseas territories, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Reunion, and has the naval capacity to conduct independent operations. HMS Queen Elizabeth and FS Charles de Gaulle are real instruments of power, not ceremonial gestures. The European Union would likely respond through the tools it commands best: economic sanctions, export controls, diplomatic pressure, and humanitarian assistance. Germany and other EU member states would apply economic pressure on Beijing. NATO as an institution would not intervene. The North Atlantic Treaty applies to the North Atlantic. But many NATO members would support US operations individually, providing the informal coalition with transatlantic depth. The central conclusion of this analysis is simple but profound. A conflict between China and the Philippines would almost certainly not remain bilateral. It would not be won or lost purely on the waters of the South China Sea. It would be decided by the breadth and depth of the coalition Manila can assemble, and by whether Beijing calculates that the costs of conflict outweigh the strategic gains. Only a handful of countries, most notably the United States, Australia, and potentially Japan in non-combat roles, would provide substantial military support to Manila. But military power is not the only form of strategic weight. Intelligence from the Five Eyes Network, logistical support from Singapore and Japan, economic pressure from the G7, diplomatic isolation through the UN and international courts, naval signaling from India in the Indian Ocean. These instruments, applied collectively, create a strategic environment in which Chinese coercion becomes extraordinarily costly. Robert Kaplan once wrote that the South China Sea is the Mediterranean of the 21st century, a theater where great powers project influence, where geography determines destiny, and where the rules of the international order are either enforced or abandoned. The Philippines sits at the center of that theater. Its defense is not merely a bilateral obligation. It is a test of the entire post-1945 security architecture. John Mearsheimer's offensive realism predicts that rising powers will challenge existing orders. China is doing precisely that, methodically, incrementally, and with extraordinary patience. The question is whether the coalition of powers committed to a rules-based Indo-Pacific possesses sufficient resolve, coordination, and strategic endurance to raise the cost of Chinese aggression high enough to deter it. In the end, the most important word in this analysis is deterrence. The goal is not to fight China. The goal is to convince Beijing that fighting would be catastrophic, that the coalition arrayed against it is broad, credible, and willing to absorb costs. If that message lands clearly, the conflict may never happen. If it does not, Manila will not stand alone. But the price of that solidarity, in lives, in treasure, in regional stability, would be staggering for everyone. The South China Sea is where the rules-based order will either hold or fracture. That is why it matters. Not just to the Philippines, to all of us. What happens when the world's busiest trade highway turns into a naval chessboard? That's the question hanging heavy over Asia right now. In the latest jolt of breaking news, Chinese warships and Coast Guard vessels have surged back into contested waters of the South China Sea, shadowing U.S. naval activity and circling flashpoints like Scarborough Shoal. One regional security official summed it up bluntly: this is no longer signaling, this is positioning. And suddenly, Manila is on high alert, allies are dialing each other up, and the calm blue waters are starting to look dangerously crowded. Picture this for a second, a stretch of sea carrying nearly $3 trillion in global trade every year, now packed with destroyers, patrol ships, and combat aircraft flying too close for comfort. This isn't some distant maritime dispute, it's the route your fuel, food, electronics, and energy supplies travel through. Scarborough Shoal, just a short sail from the Philippine coast, has once again become ground zero, with China flexing power and the Philippines responding by tightening coordination with the United States and regional partners. One wrong move here doesn't just make headlines, it rewrites security equations. And that's why this moment hits different. This isn't about one patrol or one provocation, it's about who controls the rules of the sea. Beijing's deployments challenge freedom of navigation, test international law, and directly push back against US presence in the Indo-Pacific. For the Philippines, it's an uncomfortable reminder that sovereignty isn't abstract. It's defended in real time, under real pressure. The South China Sea is no longer simmering in the background. It's boiling, and the world is watching to see who blinks first. All right, let's set the stage properly because none of this is random, and none of it started yesterday. The South China Sea has been contested for decades, long before today's headlines and warship movements. China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all lay overlapping claims to islands, reefs, and waters in this strategically priceless maritime zone. On paper, many of these claims are supposed to be governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and maritime rights. In reality, power politics often outweigh legal diagrams. What should be clear-cut lines on a map have turned into gray zones patrolled by coast guards, naval vessels, and surveillance aircraft.
What you see on the screen is a depiction of the South China Sea, and you see the red dashes around the perimeter of the South China Sea.
The tension exploded into legal warfare in 2016, when an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague delivered a landmark ruling in favor of the Philippines. The court decisively struck down China's sweeping 9-line claim, declaring it had no legal basis under UNCLOS. For Manila, the verdict was a diplomatic weapon, proof that international law was on its side. For Beijing, it was a red line. China rejected the ruling outright, calling it null and void, and has since acted as if it never existed. That legal standoff still defines today's confrontations. The Philippines cites the ruling in protests and speeches, while Chinese ships continue operating as if the map never changed. Layered on top of this is the constant presence of the United States Navy, which views the South China Sea not as a regional dispute, but as a global test case. Through regular freedom of navigation operations (FNOP), U.S. warships deliberately sail near contested features, including recent patrols close to Scarborough Shoal, to challenge what Washington calls excessive maritime claims. The message is old school but crystal clear: the seas stay open, no matter who tries to fence them off. As U.S. officials put it, these missions defend the right to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. And every time an American ship shows up, Chinese vessels shadow it, turning the South China Sea into a high-stakes standoff where law, history, and raw power collide. Now here's where things get real, because this isn't just talk anymore, it's steel in the water and aircraft in the sky. Over the past few days, China has rolled out serious naval and air power into waters claimed by the Philippines. And the composition of these forces matters. Guided missile destroyers and frigates, not symbolic patrol boats, have been tracked operating close to sensitive areas, signaling high-end combat readiness rather than routine law enforcement presence. These platforms are built for air defense, anti-ship warfare, and long-range operations. Meaning, this deployment is designed to be seen, noted, and calculated by everyone watching the radar screens. Even more eye-catching is the aerial component. China has flown H-6 strategic bombers, aircraft capable of carrying YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missiles with an estimated strike range of up to 500 kilometers. That's not defensive posturing, that's a clear reminder of reach. From those distances, major naval formations, ports, and sea lanes fall well within potential engagement zones. In simple terms, Beijing is quietly saying, we can hit far, and we can hit fast. Officially, China's Southern Theater Command is playing it cool. The patrols are described as routine, while Manila is accused of colluding with external forces, diplomatic shorthand for working too closely with the United States and its allies. According to Beijing, these deployments are meant to preserve peace and stability. It's a familiar script: assert dominance, deny escalation, blame the other side. Old playbook, new hardware. At the core, China's stated objective remains unchanged. Beijing insists it is defending territorial sovereignty and responding to what it calls provocations by rival claimants and outside powers meddling in regional affairs. But the scale and sophistication of the forces involved tell a deeper story. This isn't just about protecting claims. It's about shaping behavior, intimidating opponents, and setting red lines in real time. In the South China Sea, China isn't asking for attention anymore. It's commanding it. Washington didn't waste time responding, and it responded the way it always has, by showing up, staying visible, and refusing to blink. The U.S. Navy has surged Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers alongside littoral combat ships into waters near disputed shoals, reinforcing what officials call a persistent presence in the South China Sea. These aren't ceremonial sail-bys. Arleigh Burkes are among the most capable surface combatants afloat, packed with Aegis air defense systems, cruise missiles, and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Their deployment sends a quiet but unmistakable signal. The U.S. is prepared to operate in contested waters and stay there. At the heart of this posture is freedom of navigation operations, a doctrine Washington treats almost like sacred tradition. U.S. officials stress that these operations are fully consistent with international law and not aimed at any single country, even if everyone knows who's being challenged. One Pentagon spokesperson cut straight through the noise, stating that China's maritime claims do not deter us. In plain terms, the message is simple and old school: no nation gets to rewrite the rules of the sea by force. But beneath the tough talk lies a very real danger. The South China Sea has already seen near misses, aggressive shadowing, and even collisions between Chinese vessels during high-speed maneuvers. Add American warships, Chinese destroyers, bombers overhead, and Coast Guard vessels weaving between them, and the margin for error shrinks fast. A misjudged turn, a misread radar contact, or an overly aggressive intercept could trigger a crisis no one actually planned for. That's the uncomfortable truth of the current U.S. posture. Deterrence keeps the peace until it doesn't. And in these crowded waters, where pride, power, and patrol routes collide, escalation doesn't need intent. It only needs one bad moment. For Manila, this isn't theory or great power abstraction. This is happening right off its coast, and the response has been sharp, public, and deliberate. The Philippine government has moved quickly on the diplomatic front, issuing official protests and lodging firm representations with the Chinese embassy over both Beijing's rhetoric and its expanding maritime presence. Philippine officials have pushed back hard against accusations of collusion, stressing that defending sovereign rights is not provocation. In statements from Malacanang and the Department of Foreign Affairs, the message is consistent. China's actions are being challenged on record, in writing, and through international channels. No quiet acceptance, no silent retreat. At sea, the posture has tightened. The Philippine Navy and Philippine Coast Guard have stepped up patrols across the West Philippine Sea, keeping a closer watch on contested areas and maintaining presence near sensitive features. While Manila knows it cannot match China ship for ship, Visibility itself has become a form of resistance. Each patrol shows the same point: these waters are not abandoned, and sovereignty isn't surrendered just because the other side is bigger. Diplomatically, the Philippines is also playing the long game. Coordination with the United States remains central, especially through joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and operational planning under existing defense agreements. At the same time, Manila continues engaging ASEAN partners, pushing for unity, consultations, and a rules-based approach to maritime security. It's a careful balancing act, strengthening alliances without triggering outright escalation. The Philippine response is quiet but firm, cautious but unmistakable. Manila isn't pounding the table, but it isn't backing down either. In a region where silence can be mistaken for consent, the Philippines is making one thing clear: it's present, it's watching, and it intends to stand its ground. What's unfolding in the South China Sea doesn't stay neatly boxed inside national borders, it ripples across the entire region. For ASEAN, these tensions are a stress test of unity. Some member states are deeply uneasy about being dragged into a confrontation between major powers, preferring quiet diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. Others, especially claimant states, are increasingly vocal about the need to push back against coercive behavior before it becomes the new normal. The result is a familiar Asian dilemma: consensus versus credibility. Every flare-up exposes how hard it is to speak with one voice when national interests, threat perceptions, and economic ties to China all pull in different directions. The economic stakes raise the temperature even further. The South China Sea isn't just geopolitically sensitive, it's economically indispensable. These waters carry critical shipping lanes and energy routes that feed East Asian manufacturing hubs, fuel markets, and consumer supply chains. Any serious disruption, whether from military standoffs or heightened insurance risks, would ripple straight into ports, prices, and production lines. For economies built on just-in-time trade, even short-term instability can translate into long-term uncertainty. Then there's the most immediate danger: maritime safety. The sea is getting crowded, and not just with warships. Military vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and maritime militia are operating in close quarters, often at high speed and under political pressure. Each aggressive maneuver, each shadowing incident, raises the odds of an accident, and in this environment, accidents don't stay accidents for long. One collision, one misread intention, and the region could find itself in an escalatory spiral no one planned for, but everyone would have to deal with. In short, the South China Sea is becoming more than a dispute zone, it's a regional fault line. And the longer tensions simmer, the harder it becomes for Asian, markets, and mariners alike to pretend this is business as usual. At the core of all this naval muscle flexing is a much quieter battlefield, international law, and that fight may be the most consequential of all. The legal backbone of the South China Sea disputes is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Under UNCLOS, coastal states are granted clearly defined maritime entitlements, including territorial seas and exclusive economic zones extending up to 200 nautical miles. This framework is what anchors the Philippines' legal position in the West Philippine Sea. Manila argues that its claims aren't based on power or history, but on codified international law that most of the world recognizes and follows. In theory, UNCLOS is supposed to remove ambiguity. In practice, it's become the very thing being contested. China, however, plays by a different script. Beijing asserts historical rights that it argues predate UNCLOS and justify its extensive presence and deployments across much of the South China Sea. This interpretation has been widely challenged, especially after the 2016 arbitral ruling, but China continues to treat these claims as non-negotiable. From Beijing's perspective, patrols, exercises, and ship deployments are not violations. They are enforcement of long-held sovereignty. Law, in this view, bends to history and power. The United States cuts straight across that argument. Washington insists that freedom of navigation and overflight are protected under UNCLOS norms and customary international law, regardless of competing sovereignty claims. That's the legal logic behind U.S. freedom of navigation operations. They are not about ownership of reefs or shoals, but about preventing any single state from turning international waters into restricted zones. Every FONOP is a legal statement made with a warship, and that's the real tension. One side sees law as fixed rules, the other treats it as flexible history. Until those visions align or one clearly prevails, the South China Sea will remain not just a military standoff, but a legal one, fought ship by ship, patrol by patrol. When you strip away the press statements and naval posturing, what's left is a tense strategic equation, and none of the outcomes are guaranteed to stay tidy. One possible path is de-escalation, driven by sustained diplomacy, military hotlines, and confidence-building measures. This is the scenario everyone publicly claims to want: fewer risky maneuvers, clearer communication, and a return to managed competition. But let's be real, de-escalation in the South China Sea doesn't mean ships go home. It means tensions are contained, not resolved, and restraint becomes a daily operational choice rather than a permanent fix. The more likely near-term scenario is a prolonged standoff. Persistent patrols, shadowing operations, and shows of force continue, but without major incidents. Friction becomes normalized. Each side learns the other's habits, thresholds, and red lines. This kind of frozen confrontation feels stable on the surface, but it's exhausting, expensive, and inherently fragile. One political crisis elsewhere or one aggressive captain at sea can shatter the balance overnight. The most dangerous scenario is escalation, and the scary part is that it wouldn't have to be intentional. An unintended collision, an aircraft intercept gone wrong, or a misinterpreted radar lock could trigger rapid military responses before diplomacy has time to catch up. In an environment thick with nationalism and alliance commitments, even a minor incident can spiral faster than leaders can control. Complicating all of this is the accelerating technological edge. Advanced missile platforms, long-range strike systems, real-time surveillance drones, and networked sensors are compressing decision-making timelines. Commanders now see more, track faster, and react quicker, which sounds stabilizing, until it isn't. Speed reduces room for human judgment, and in contested waters, that can turn seconds into strategic consequences. Bottom line, the South China Sea isn't drifting toward resolution, it's hardening into a test of endurance, discipline, and crisis management. The danger isn't war by design, it's war by miscalculation, and history tells us that's often how the worst ones start. Zoom out for a second, and it's obvious the South China Sea isn't just about reefs and shoals anymore, it's a front line in the US-China strategic rivalry. Every patrol, every statement, every joint exercise feeds into a much larger contest over influence, credibility, and leadership in the Indo-Pacific. For Washington, presence equals commitment to allies, to international law, to an open maritime order. For Beijing, pushing back is about reshaping that order and proving it can no longer be dictated from outside the region. The result? Alliances are tightening, defense cooperation is deepening, and neutral ground is getting harder to find. Multilateral diplomacy is supposed to be the pressure valve, but progress has been painfully slow. UN platforms and related mechanisms offer space for dialogue, confidence building, and rule setting. Yet consensus remains elusive. Competing interests, economic dependencies, and strategic caution keep outcomes watered down. The long-discussed code of conduct in the South China Sea, for example, moves forward inch by inch, always discussed, never quite delivered. Still, these forums matter. In a crisis-prone environment, even slow diplomacy is better than silence. That's why dialogue, however imperfect, remains essential. Military deterrence may prevent immediate conflict, but only sustained diplomatic engagement and respect for international norms can prevent long-term instability. Hotlines, maritime communication protocols, and regular consultations don't solve sovereignty disputes, but they can stop misunderstandings from turning into flashpoints. In a region this tense, talking is not weakness, it's damage control. What we're witnessing now is a clear escalation in geopolitical intensity. China's expanded naval deployments, the United States' firm maritime posture, and the Philippines' heightened state of alert all point to a South China Sea that is more contested, more crowded, and more consequential than ever. This isn't a temporary spike, it's a new normal taking shape in real time. The risks are obvious and serious. Military operations intersect with strategic rivalry and unresolved legal claims, creating a volatile mix where miscalculation could carry regional, even global consequences. Trade routes, energy flows, alliance credibility, and international law are all on the line. When great power competition plays out at sea, the margin for error is dangerously thin. The path forward is narrow but clear. Stronger diplomacy, greater transparency, and consistent adherence to lawful maritime conduct are no longer optional. They're essential. The South China Sea has always been a crossroads of commerce and culture. Whether it becomes a corridor of cooperation or a theater of confrontation depends on the choices being made right now, while the ships are still maneuvering and the lines are not yet crossed.
Get out there!
What does it mean when a state stops calling harassment harassment and starts calling it piracy? That single word choice, loaded with centuries of legal, moral, and strategic weight, is what made the latest confrontation at 2nd Thomas Shoal fundamentally different from the dozens of incidents that preceded it. When the Philippines publicly accused China of piracy following a violent encounter in the South China Sea, it was not merely describing an event at sea. It was signaling a shift in narrative, posture, and possibly escalation thresholds. The incident itself followed a now familiar pattern. Philippine vessels conducting a resupply mission to 2nd Thomas Shoal were confronted by Chinese maritime forces employing aggressive maneuvering, boarding actions, and the seizure of equipment. Such encounters have occurred repeatedly in recent years. What changed was Manila's framing. By invoking piracy, a term rooted in international law and historically associated with criminal violence beyond state authority, the Philippines implicitly challenged Beijing's attempt to normalize coercion under the guise of law enforcement and sovereignty patrols. This rhetorical escalation matters because language shapes legitimacy. Most Southeast Asian states facing pressure from China have relied on calibrated, cautious phrasing. Unsafe maneuvers, incidents, or miscalculations. Vietnam has protested. Malaysia has quietly reinforced. Indonesia has renamed waters and strengthened patrols, all while avoiding labels that could legally or diplomatically harden positions. By contrast, the Philippines has increasingly chosen clarity over ambiguity. Calling an act piracy reframes the encounter from a bilateral dispute into a question of international order, rules at sea, and collective response. Strategically, the episode fits squarely within China's established pattern of gray zone maritime coercion. The deliberate use of Coast Guard, maritime militia, and quasi-civilian assets to apply force without crossing the threshold of declared armed conflict. What makes this case distinct is how it intersects with alliance dynamics.
Our mutual defense treaty is the bedrock of that.
We share concerns about China's coercion in the South China Sea.
Unlike many regional states, the Philippines operates under a formal mutual defense treaty with the United States, conducts regular joint patrols, and has openly aligned its maritime posture with broader Indo-Pacific deterrence efforts. The piracy accusation, therefore, resonates far beyond the reef itself, raising questions about precedent, escalation control, and how far coercion can go before it triggers collective security mechanisms. In that sense, Second Thomas Shoal is no longer just a rusting ship on a submerged reef. It has become a test case of narrative power, of legal framing, and of whether sustained gray zone pressure can still hide behind technicalities when the language of international crime enters the conversation. At the heart of the latest South China Sea confrontation lies Second Thomas Shoal, also called Ayungin Shoal by the Philippines. A low-lying reef roughly 105 nautical miles west of Palawan that sits well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, EEZ, as defined under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tayo.
Manila has maintained a permanent presence there since 1999 by grounding the aging transport BRP Sierra Madre to reinforce its territorial claim, a symbolic fixture of sovereignty that China continues to contest.
There was a RORI mission to BRP Sierra Madre. No untoward incident. There were 4 Coast Guard ships of China that were spotted, but they did not do any coercive nor aggressive actions.
On June 17, 2024, a routine rotation and reprovisioning RORE mission by the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP, to deliver food, water, and other supplies to personnel aboard Sierra Madre devolved into violence when Chinese Coast Guard vessels aggressively intervened. According to the Philippines, Chinese personnel boarded at least one Philippine boat using cutlasses, spears, and knives, forcing Filipino sailors to defend themselves without firearms, per operational orders.
Tropa natin yan.
Manila reports that 8 Filipino personnel were wounded during the clash, including one sailor who lost his right thumb amid the melee. Philippine military leadership did not mince words.
The Coast Guard ang nag-rescue sa ating mga wounded personnel. Sila rin nagbigay ng first aid.
AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. publicly characterized the episode as akin to piracy, stating that Chinese personnel had seized 7 rifles still boxed for delivery and damaged communications and navigational equipment on the Filipino vessels. In a formal demand to Beijing, Manila later insisted on 60 million Filipino pesos in compensation for the equipment loss and the injuries sustained by Seaman First Class Jeffrey Facundo, whose medical care for the severed digit was part of the total cost estimate. From Manila's perspective, the weapons involved were not firearms, but bladed or improvised handheld implements used by Chinese forces during boarding, showing the irregular and brazen nature of the clash that triggered Manila's piracy label. Beijing, however, offered a sharply different account, rejecting Manila's narrative as distorted and insisting that Chinese actions were reasonable, lawful, professional, and restrained, even as its Coast Guard continued patrols in contested areas. In the immediate aftermath, the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy bolstered their presence around Second Thomas Shoal, deploying additional vessels and conducting more frequent patrols to deter further interference. Moves the AFP described as necessary to uphold navigation rights and protect Filipino personnel operating in waters Manila considers sovereign.
To unidentified foreign vessel at Sabina Shoal, this is Philippine Coast Guard, BRP Cabra MRRV 4409.
This incident did not occur in isolation. It fits into a broader pattern of maritime confrontations between the two countries, ranging from water cannon engagements against Filipino fishing boats in December 2025 to repeated blocking and collision incidents near Scarborough Shoal and other contested features of the South China Sea. To understand why tensions keep boiling over at Second Thomas Shoal, you have to stop thinking of it as just a reef on a map. It sits inside the Spratly Islands, one of the most hotly contested island systems in the world, and just a short distance from major sea lanes that carry trillions of dollars in trade through the South China Sea every year. Control here is not symbolic. It shapes who watches, who moves, and who decides what is normal at sea. For the Philippines, the shoal is deeply personal. Since 1999, Manila has maintained a constant presence through the grounded BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting World War II-era vessel deliberately run aground and turned into a living outpost. Filipino Marines rotate through harsh conditions, relying on periodic resupply missions for food, water, and medicine. Every successful run is quiet proof that the Philippines is still there. Every blocked mission feels like a test of resolve. That is where the pattern begins. Time after time, Chinese vessels have attempted to block, shadow, or physically disrupt Philippine resupply efforts. These are rarely dramatic naval battles. Instead, they unfold as tense standoffs at close range, ships cutting across bows, engines throttling forward, horns blaring, crews shouting across decks. The objective is not to sink a ship, but to exhaust, intimidate, and normalize interference without firing a shot.
Sa ngayon, nagbuga na naman ng tubig ang water cannon.
Since 2021, the Philippine Coast Guard has done something unusual in maritime disputes. It has turned cameras outward. Video after video released by the PCG shows Chinese vessels using water cannons, executing dangerous close-quarter maneuvers, and deliberately obstructing Philippine boats on humanitarian and military resupply missions. These clips matter because they strip away abstraction. You see sailors knocked off balance by high-pressure water jets. You hear engines straining as hulls pass within meters of collision. It is pressure made visible.
Hey! Stop! Hey! Stop! 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 Get out there!
What makes Second Thomas Shoal different from other disputed features is repetition. This is not a one-off crisis that fades from headlines. It is a cycle. Resupply planned, interference anticipated, confrontation likely. Each encounter builds on the last, slowly raising stakes while testing how much friction can be applied before something snaps. Over time, the shoal has evolved from a static claim into a living stress test of endurance, credibility, and deterrence in the South China Sea. In short, Second Thomas Shoal is not dangerous because of what it is, but because of what keeps happening there, again and again, in plain sight. Under international law, piracy has a very specific meaning. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines it as violent acts committed for private ends on the high seas, typically by non-state actors, classic criminals, not uniformed personnel flying a national flag. By that strict definition, confrontations involving state-affiliated forces usually fall outside the legal box labeled piracy. That is where the complexity and the intent comes in. When Chinese Coast Guard or maritime personnel act under state authority, their actions are normally classified as law enforcement activity, however aggressive or disputed. Legally speaking, that makes the Philippines' piracy label difficult to sustain in a courtroom sense. But Manila was not arguing a case before judges. It was speaking to an audience far larger than any tribunal. In practice, the term piracy functions less as a legal charge and more as a strategic signal. It strips away technical language and reframes the incident in moral terms that are immediately understood. Violence at sea, seizure of property, injury to sailors. It challenges the idea that such behavior can be dismissed as routine patrols or administrative enforcement. In one word, the Philippines recast coercion as criminality. The objective is clear. By using language that resonates beyond bilateral diplomacy, Manila seeks to internationalize the incident, to push it out of the narrow frame of a Philippines-China dispute and into the broader conversation about maritime norms, freedom of navigation, and acceptable conduct at sea. Whether or not piracy holds up legally, it succeeds rhetorically by forcing the world to ask a sharper question. When does enforcement stop looking like law and start looking like force? China rarely leads with gray holes and naval guns. Instead, it sends white ships. The primary instruments of pressure in contested waters are not the Navy, but the China Coast Guard and a vast network of maritime militia. Vessels that look civilian, behave aggressively, and operate in the space between peace and war. This is not accidental, it is design. The tactics are now well established. Chinese vessels block approaches, shadow targets at close range, board foreign boats, interfere with equipment, and maintain a constant presence that wears opponents down over time. These encounters are calibrated to stay just below the threshold that would justify a military response, while still imposing real physical and psychological pressure on crews at sea. No missiles, no declarations, just relentless friction. This approach is backed by scale. The China Coast Guard operates the largest Coast Guard fleet in the world, including multiple megacutters exceeding 10,000 tons, larger than many countries' frigates. Their size is not just symbolic. It allows Chinese ships to intimidate smaller vessels simply by proximity, to absorb collisions, and to dominate contested spaces without ever firing a shot. Presence becomes power. For years, Manila tried quiet diplomacy. It avoided cameras, softened language, and handled incidents through back channels. That approach has now clearly changed. The Philippines has embraced transparency as a tool of defense, publicly releasing incident footage, photographs, and detailed briefings after confrontations at sea. By showing what its crews face in real time, Manila is no longer asking the world to take its word. It is putting evidence on the table. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. The loss of effective access to Scarborough Shoal in 2012 was a turning point. Filipino fishermen were gradually pushed out, patrols were blocked, and control slipped without a single shot being fired. That experience left a lasting imprint on policymakers and the public alike. Silence and ambiguity did not preserve access. Visibility mattered. Operationally, the response has been steady rather than dramatic. The Philippine Coast Guard and Navy have increased patrol frequency in contested waters, while the armed forces of the Philippines have expanded maritime domain awareness, using radar, satellite tracking, aerial surveillance, and allied information sharing to reduce blind spots at sea. The goal is simple but critical. Know who is where, doing what, and record it. Public opinion has moved in parallel. Repeated national surveys show consistently high domestic support for defending maritime claims and for closer security cooperation with allies, particularly the United States. For many Filipinos, the issue is no longer abstract geopolitics. It is about fishermen blocked from traditional grounds, sailors injured on routine missions, and sovereignty tested in plain sight. The Philippine response reflects a hard-earned lesson. Deterrence is not only about ships and treaties, it is about narrative control, persistence, and public backing. By pairing transparency with steady operational pressure, Manila is signaling that it will no longer manage maritime disputes quietly, and that endurance, not silence, now defines its posture. For the Philippines, every confrontation at sea now carries an alliance calculation. The Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States has existed for more than 7 decades, but its relevance has never felt more immediate. In 2023 to 2024, Washington repeatedly and explicitly reaffirmed that the treaty applies to armed attacks on Philippine forces in the South China Sea, including Coast Guard and public vessels. That clarity matters. It narrows gray areas and raises the cost of miscalculation. Cooperation has followed rhetoric. The two allies now conduct joint patrols, expand intelligence sharing, and operate under widened access arrangements through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Importantly, this is not about permanent U.S. bases. The emphasis is on rotational presence, interoperability, and speed, being able to operate together seamlessly when pressure rises. Deterrence here is subtle, not a flag planted, but a signal constantly reinforced. Across Southeast Asia, the Philippines is being watched closely. Other claimant states, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, understand that what happens to Philippine vessels today could happen to theirs tomorrow. The concern is not a single clash, but the normalization of coercion. Aggressive actions slowly becoming routine, unremarkable, and therefore tolerated. Yet regional responses remain constrained. ASEAN operates on consensus, a structure that prizes unity but limits decisive collective action. As a result, responses tend to be cautious, fragmented, and national rather than regional. This creates a dangerous gap where pressure accumulates at sea faster than institutions can respond. The risk is not sudden war, but incremental escalation, one low-level confrontation at a time. Beijing has categorically rejected the Philippines' accusations. Its position is consistent and carefully maintained. Chinese forces are operating within what China claims as its maritime jurisdiction, while Philippine missions are framed as deliberate provocations. In this narrative, China is enforcing order. Others are destabilizing it. Equally consistent is Beijing's opposition to external involvement. The United States in particular is portrayed as an outside agitator, turning local disputes into strategic flashpoints. This is not just diplomacy, it is information warfare. Competing narratives are aimed at different audiences: reassurance at home, justification regionally, and deflection internationally. Control of the story is treated as seriously as control of the sea. The most dangerous factor in the South China Sea today is proximity. Ships maneuver within meters, crews interact face-to-face. Tensions play out in real time, often without robust incident prevention or crisis management mechanisms to slow things down. In gray zone operations, ambiguity is a feature, but it is also a liability. The risks are painfully human. An injury, a collision, a panicked reaction, an improvised weapon used a second too late or too early. None of these require intent to escalate. They only require exhaustion, fear, or misjudgment. In such an environment, de-escalation becomes harder precisely because nothing officially counts as war. In the short term, pressure at Second Thomas Shoal is unlikely to ease. Philippine resupply missions will continue, and Chinese interference is likely to persist. Neither side can afford to blink without signaling weakness. In the medium term, Manila will lean even more heavily on alliance support, transparency, and legal diplomatic signaling. The goal is endurance, keeping claims alive, costs visible, and norms contested rather than surrendered. The long-term challenge is deeper. Can deterrence based on presence, publicity, and partnerships remain sustainable without binding regional enforcement mechanisms? Or does prolonged gray zone pressure eventually erode even the most carefully calibrated responses? The second Thomas Shoal incident is not an anomaly. It is part of an entrenched pattern, one defined by repetition rather than rupture. The Philippines' use of the word piracy reflects a deliberate effort to reframe maritime coercion as a violation of shared international norms, not a manageable bilateral irritation. In that sense, Second Thomas Shoal has become a barometer. It shows how South China Sea disputes are likely to be managed in the years ahead, incrementally, persistently, and deliberately below the threshold of open conflict. What remains uncertain is how long that balance can hold, and who ultimately pays the price if it breaks.
If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
This exercise is really valuable in that sense, that we will learn so much about the armed forces of the Philippines, and we will learn how we will need to adapt to the new challenges, the new threats that we are facing today, and the threats that we will be facing in the future.
The Philippines is entering a period where every move in its defense planning carries far greater weight than it did even a few years ago. Confrontations with China in the West Philippine Sea have grown sharper, more deliberate, and far more confident on Beijing's side. Water cannon strikes, dangerous blocking maneuvers, and electronic jamming have shifted from rare incidents to routine encounters, signaling that the status quo is steadily eroding. At the same time, fears are rising that a conflict involving Taiwan could easily spill into Philippine territory, drawing the archipelago into a regional storm, whether it wants to be involved or not. Geography offers little protection. If war broke out in the Taiwan Strait, Philippine airspace, waters, and military installations would instantly become strategic ground. Against this backdrop, the armed forces of the Philippines is undergoing a dramatic evolution, moving away from decades of internal security and counterinsurgency and toward the nation's first serious attempt at building a true external defense posture. New missile systems, radar networks, fighter aircraft plans, and naval acquisitions mark the largest shift in military priorities since the Cold War. But equipment alone doesn't answer the most important question now hanging over the entire defense establishment. Can the Philippines hold the line alone before allies arrive? It is this question, unsettling, necessary, and urgent, that has driven the creation of the new Solo Defense War Plan. The exercise forces the AFP to assess the uncomfortable scenarios many hoped never to consider. Defending the archipelago for the first 30 days of a major conflict with no guaranteed reinforcements, no immediate allied intervention, and no assumptions of instant support. It demands an honest accounting of the country's vulnerabilities, from fuel reserves and ammunition stocks to mobility gaps and command networks. It also requires a sober look at the military's ability to redistribute forces between Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao under contested conditions, a task that challenges even far more equipped armed forces. In a region where power balances are shifting rapidly and conflict risks are no longer theoretical, this moment matters because it answers a simple but defining question. If war arrives before help does, how long can the Philippines stand on its own? The exercise isn't about pessimism, it's about facing reality, preparing for worst-case scenarios, and ensuring that the country's first line of defense is ready long before any ally is able to respond.
Why is it important for us to train? Yes. Well, the mandate of the Armed Forces of the Philippines is to defend the territory and our sovereignty.
The centerpiece of the Philippines' newest defense effort is Ajax Dagat PA 2025, a sweeping war game designed to push the armed forces far beyond routine drills and into the realm of full-spectrum national defense. At its core, the exercise serves a singular purpose: to validate the country's new unilateral defense strategy, known as Bantay Kalayan, a plan built on the premise that the Philippines must be able to fight alone, at least in the crucial opening month of a major conflict. Rather than rehearsing ideal scenarios or controlled simulations, the exercise forces commanders and units to confront the harsh realities of a sudden attack. Disrupted communications, contested airspace, sabotaged logistics, and simultaneous threats across multiple domains. It is, in every sense, a stress test for a nation preparing to protect itself without immediate outside assistance. The war game's design reflects this seriousness. For the first time, the AFP is examining how its forces would respond if its early warning systems were challenged, its mobility restricted, or its supply lines degraded. Command posts must practice shifting to backup networks. Air units must calculate what they can maintain once missiles begin falling. And naval forces must plan for operations even when sea routes are under pressure.
We do not engage in political disputes or allegations. This matter should be resolved through appropriate legal and institutional mechanisms and not public confrontation.
The exercise is built to expose gaps, whether in fuel stockpiles, ammunition reserves, joint coordination, or operational endurance, long before they become fatal weaknesses in a real conflict. Every failure uncovered now becomes a correction for later. But what makes Ajax Dagat PA 2025 even more significant is its scope. The AFP is no longer focusing exclusively on land maneuver battles or isolated skirmishes. The exercise places heavy emphasis on integrated air and missile defense, probing how the military can shield critical bases and civilian infrastructure from long-range strikes. It includes scenarios for protecting offshore energy platforms, vital national assets that lie within the very waters where tensions with China are highest. Amphibious units practice retaking islands and seaports lost in the early stages of conflict, while naval elements refine surface fire support missions designed to suppress hostile landing forces. Airfields and coastlines are put under simulated attack, requiring rapid dispersal of aircraft and urgent fortification of defensive positions. Modern threats are not ignored. Cyber units engage in offensive and defensive operations to defend command networks. Electronic warfare teams simulate jamming and counter-jamming across multiple regions. Even space domain threats are folded into the exercise, acknowledging that satellite disruption, once a distant concern, is now part of the real strategic environment. The AFP is, for perhaps the first time, rehearsing a war that spans land, air, sea, cyber, and space simultaneously. Ajax Dagat PA 2025 isn't just another military event. It is the most honest, unfiltered look the Philippines has taken at its own ability to defend its sovereignty in a rapidly changing region. And the questions raised by the exercise, both encouraging and uncomfortable, will define the country's defense decisions in the years ahead. One of the most consequential changes in the Philippines' new defense architecture is the creation of the AFP Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, a formation activated in October 2025 and built specifically for one purpose: to take command the moment the country enters a wartime footing.
Considering the threats that we're facing, syempre i-compare natin yung capability natin with the capability of our other neighbors.
For decades, the armed forces relied on its general headquarters battle staff to manage both routine operations and crisis response. But the demands of a potential high-intensity conflict have now outgrown what an overstretched staff can realistically handle. STRATCOM represents a clean break from that old structure.
As we are in a regimented life, no, we respect the freedom of speech, and of course, meron din kaming sariling saloobin bawat isa sa amin.
It is designed from the ground up to command and coordinate large-scale operations across the Philippine archipelago, fusing all domains of warfare into a single, fully dedicated wartime command. Unlike previous centralized setups, Stratcom assumes responsibility over the areas that would immediately come under threat in any major conflict. The exclusive economic zone, outposts in the West Philippine Sea, northern and western air defense sectors, and the multi-domain environment where the Philippines would have to operate under pressure. Its mandate spans air, sea, cyber, and space operations, allowing it to pull information from diverse sensors, satellites, radars, naval patrols, cyber units, and air defense platforms. This structure gives the AFP something it has never had before: a command center built not for day-to-day coordination, but for rapid wartime decision-making, synchronized targeting, and national-level operational control. The significance of this change cannot be overstated. By transferring wartime responsibilities from GHQ to a completely new structure, the AFP eliminates one of its biggest vulnerabilities. The transition lag between peace and conflict. In the past, GHQ had to transform itself on the fly, shifting from administrative duties to warfighting command, a transition that could introduce fatal delays in the opening hours of an invasion. With Stratcom, that gap closes. The military gains the ability to activate unified command at a moment's notice, bringing together air defense units, naval forces, ground commands, missile batteries, and cyber defense teams under one synchronized operational plan. Stratcom becomes the nerve center, the brain, responsible for deciding where to deploy forces, how to defend critical bases, and how to manage the chaos of multi-front threats.
I'm very happy to report that yung pong ating mga miyembro ng Armed Forces of the Philippines are very professional. Kaya kahit na po may mga ganitong nangyayari sa ating lipunan, we are aware of what is happening, but of course, we remain professional.
General Bronner captured the essence of the decision during its activation, noting frankly, the GHQ battle staff cannot transform into a full-blown warfighting staff. That is why we rushed the creation of Strategic Command. His words underline the urgency driving the AFP's reform efforts. Stratcom was not created for peacetime efficiency. It was created because time is now a luxury the Philippines may not have if conflict erupts in the region. Stratcom is more than a new headquarters. It is the institutional recognition that modern war requires a different level of coordination, speed, and clarity than the Philippines has ever needed before.
It follows the truck. It follows the person.
In a scenario where the country must fight alone, even briefly, this command structure may become the single most important factor determining whether the AFP can withstand the opening phase of a conflict until help arrives. Pagasa Island, known internationally as Thitu, is no longer just a remote outpost. It has become the emotional and strategic centerpiece of the Philippines' frontline defense in the West Philippine Sea. Home to around 400 Filipinos, it is the only island in the Spratlys with a functioning civilian community, complete with families, teachers, local officials, and children who attend school under the shadow of military patrols and foreign surveillance. Unlike uninhabited reefs or remote military detachments, Pagasa represents something far more delicate, a living, breathing community that exists directly inside one of the world's most contested maritime flashpoints. For that reason alone, analysts warn that if conflict with China ever erupted, Pagasa would be among the first and most vulnerable targets, not just for its location, but for what it symbolizes. This reality is why the island has become central to the Philippines' newest defense exercises. Amphibious units train along its beaches, rehearsing how to reinforce or retake a threatened island. ISR teams practice collecting intelligence under pressure, mapping possible landing zones, and monitoring surrounding waters constantly patrolled by Chinese vessels. airlift drills simulate rapid troop deployment in case the island's defenders need reinforcements within hours, not days. These activities aren't theoretical. They reflect urgent planning shaped by Pagasa's geography and the growing likelihood that any confrontation in the West Philippine Sea would place the island directly in harm's way. Strategically, Pagasa's importance stretches far beyond its modest size. It is the nearest Philippine-held territory to China's militarized bases on Subi Reef, installations equipped with long-range sensors, missile systems, and runways capable of hosting fighter jets and heavy aircraft. That proximity places Pagasa under constant surveillance, and in a crisis, under immediate operational threat. Yet its value is not only tactical, but symbolic. Losing Pagasa would not simply be the loss of a small community. It would fracture the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, weaken its legal and diplomatic standing, and ripple through regional perceptions of Manila's ability to hold territory in disputed waters. For the AFP, Pagasa is more than a point on a map. It is the frontline staging ground where readiness is tested, deterrence is demonstrated, and the stakes of any future conflict become painfully clear. Every exercise conducted there carries a quiet, sobering reminder. Defending the community on Pagasa is not only about holding territory, but about protecting the human face of the country's maritime claim. This first month matters because it aligns with how modern conflict is expected to unfold. China's strategy in the region depends on rapid dominance, taking or neutralizing key territories before outside powers can intervene decisively. It is built around speed, shock, and the ability to create strategic facts on the ground faster than others can respond. On the other side of the equation, even the Philippines' closest allies face major hurdles in reacting quickly. U.S. naval strike groups need time to reposition. Japanese and Australian forces must navigate political processes, mobilization timelines, and long transit routes. In this high-stakes race, the Philippines must absorb the first blow and remain operational long enough for the political, logistical, and military machinery of its partners to move into place. This is where the new training regime becomes brutally clear. The AFP's objective is to measure how long it can keep the country functional under extreme pressure. Can airfields survive repeated strikes and continue launching sorties? Can fuel depots stay protected long enough to keep aircraft, vehicles, and ships moving? Can radar sites withstand electronic attacks and maintain situational awareness? Can remote islands like Pagasa hold out under siege? Can ports remain open for logistics, or will they be shut down early in the campaign? Every one of these questions cuts to the heart of the country's survival during the opening phase of conflict. The exercise forces commanders to confront the raw truth. Survival is not about grand victories in the first week, but endurance. The Philippines' ability to hold air bases, keep radars alive, protect critical infrastructure, and retain control of key outposts will determine not only how long it can fight, but whether allies will have something left to reinforce when they finally arrive. The first month expectation may be harsh, but it reflects the reality of modern warfare and the urgency behind preparing for it now, rather than when it is already too late. A major shift is now underway inside the armed forces of the Philippines, a historic pivot from internal counterinsurgency toward a true external defense posture. At the heart of this transition is the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, or CADC, the first official doctrine to embrace the idea that the country must secure its territory from the coastlines outward. For decades, Philippine defense thinking stopped at the shoreline. Now it extends deep into the West Philippine Sea and across every maritime corridor surrounding the archipelago.
With the fluid security situation in our region, it is imperative that the armed forces of the Philippines, and of course the Navy, is substantially equipped, trained, and always on alert to respond to any and all exigencies that may confront our nation.
CADC represents a mental and strategic break from the past. It acknowledges that the threats facing the Philippines are no longer confined to insurgents in the mountains, but powerful state actors projecting force across sea and air. Running parallel to CADC is the Bantay-Calayan Plan, the Philippines' new unilateral battle blueprint, quietly developed in late 2024 and refined through multiple Dagat PA exercises. While CADC shapes the overarching doctrine, Bantay-Calayan is the practical warfighting script.
Guided by the values of honor, service, and patriotism, the dedication and sacrifices of the men and women of the armed forces of the Philippines transpire to make our nation stronger and safer.
It is built on island denial strategies, sea denial operations, layered missile defense, distributed basing, and the assumption that Philippine units will have to operate independently, dispersed, and under intense pressure. The plan demands flexibility, missile batteries shifting overnight, air assets dispersing across hidden strips, naval units repositioning constantly, and ground forces preparing to lose communications but continue the fight. CADC and Bantay-Calayan mark the clearest sign yet that the Philippines is preparing to move beyond symbolic presence and into genuine territorial defense. Another striking change emerging from Dagat PA 2025 is the deliberate reduction in troop numbers, from the usual 3,000 participants to only around 2,000 this year. This is not a downgrade, it is a recalibration. The AFP is moving away from massed formations towards specialized, precision-oriented units built for multi-domain battles. Instead of sheer numbers, the exercise now puts a premium on elite capabilities. Rapid reaction teams, missile operators, drone specialists, cyber analysts, amphibious platoons, and air defense crews. What makes this evolution even more significant is the rising role of the Reserve Command, the Philippine Coast Guard, and the Philippine National Police. Their inclusion reflects the reality that any real-world crisis in the archipelago will not be fought by the military alone. Coast Guard vessels may be the first responders at sea. Police units may secure ports, bridges, and urban centers. Reservists will fill logistics gaps and defend critical infrastructure. Integrating these agencies into the war game mirrors the kind of first response environment the Philippines would face in an actual conflict, one where the lines between military and civilian protection blur, and victory depends on coordination as much as firepower. This transition shows a truth shaping modern warfare. The next conflict will not hinge on the most boots on the ground, but on which units can shoot, move, and communicate faster across multiple domains. Perhaps the most unprecedented element of Dagat PA 2025 is its expansion into full multi-domain warfare, cyber, electronic, and space. These domains were once theoretical concerns. Today, they are inseparable from modern conflict. Cyber units drilled against simulated attacks targeting energy grids, satellite links, banking networks, and military command systems, a scenario that mirrors the first strike in almost every major conflict today. Electronic warfare teams practiced counter-jamming maneuvers, a direct response to China's growing reliance on electronic interference around the West Philippine Sea. The fact that these drills now exist marks a profound strategic shift. It acknowledges that the Philippines must be able to keep radars alive, keep communications running, and keep its digital infrastructure functioning even while under coordinated attack. For the first time, space domain threats were also woven into the exercise. Units rehearsed how to maintain satellite communication resilience, track incoming missile trajectories, and integrate space-based ISR data during combat scenarios. This signals an AFP entering the era of modern warfare, where what happens in orbit can decide what happens on the ground. Every component of this year's exercise sends a message. To China, it signals that the Philippines is no longer preparing as a passive state, hoping diplomacy alone will hold the line. Instead, it is shaping itself into a resilient archipelagic fortress, one prepared to deny, delay, and disrupt any attempt to seize territory quickly. To the United States and allied partners, the exercise shows that Manila is no longer relying solely on mutual defense treaties for survival. The Philippines is building its own credible self-defense capacity, a crucial requirement for any alliance looking to operate effectively in contested waters. For allies watching closely, this enhances confidence that Manila will not collapse in the opening days of conflict, but will stay standing long enough for reinforcements to matter. The ripple effects across the region are immediate. Taiwan views the exercises as part of its own defensive buffer. Japan sees expanded opportunities for joint ISR and air defense cooperation. Australia welcomes Manila's push for resilience, knowing it reduces strategic pressure across the first island chain. Even ASEAN states are taking notice, some cautiously, others quietly encouraged, as the Philippines transitions from a reactive posture to a more assertive, prepared role in regional security. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
Sandy K.
Sandy K.
Sandy K.
Battle 5202. China has illegal sovereignty rights over the islands in the South China Sea.
Oh no!
Sandy K, a scatter of tiny sandbars near Pagasa Island, has abruptly emerged as the newest pressure point in the South China Sea. For years, this reef was little more than a footnote on maritime maps, submerged at high tide and ignored by most of the world. But in 2025, it has been thrust to the center of the Philippines-China rivalry, forcing the question now hanging over Manila. Can President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. hold the line if Beijing pushes harder? The stakes escalated dramatically in April 2025, when Chinese Coast Guard personnel reportedly landed on Sandy Cay and planted a Chinese flag. This was no routine harassment at sea. It was a brazen act of sovereignty assertion, crossing a line from subtle gray zone tactics into overt symbolic conquest. The Philippines responded swiftly, dispatching its own mission to the sandbank, unfurling the national flag, and rejecting Beijing's claim that it had already dealt with Philippine personnel. In that moment, Sandy Cay transformed from an overlooked sandbar into a contested marker of national pride and sovereignty. Barely a month later, the confrontation turned physical.
China's Coast Guard mission number 21559. This is MMOB 3002. BRP Dato Sambay, Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources.
On May 21st, 2025, Chinese Coast Guard vessels blasted Philippine research ships with water cannons and even sideswiped one vessel in a deliberate, dangerous maneuver. Manila immediately released video evidence, showing the world the recklessness of China's actions. The backlash was swift. Washington branded the incident dangerous and destabilizing, while Tokyo and Canberra issued strong condemnations. For Marcos, the clash was not only about defending territory, it was about winning the information war, demonstrating to allies and global audiences that China's peaceful rise is anything but peaceful in Philippine waters. And this is where the broader picture comes into play. Sandy Cay is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of Chinese coercion and Philippine resistance. The clash coincides with a surge of allied activity in the region, from US freedom of navigation operations to joint patrols with Australia and Japan. Marcos' strategy of assertive transparency, exposing, publicizing, and internationalizing every provocation has turned Sandy Cay into more than a pile of sand. It has become a litmus test of whether alliances, international law, and global opinion can blunt Beijing's creeping advances in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is no ordinary stretch of water. It is one of the most important arteries of global commerce and power projection. Every year, an estimated $3.4 trillion worth of trade flows through its sea lanes, making it one of the busiest and most valuable maritime highways in the world. Oil tankers, container ships, and naval vessels from every major power depend on these waters. Beneath the waves lie vast reserves of oil and natural gas, alongside some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, a source of livelihood for millions across Southeast Asia. Whoever dominates the South China Sea doesn't just hold sway over resources, but over one of the most strategic choke points of the 21st century economy. For the Philippines, this is not an abstract reality. It is survival. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, in The Hague, delivered a landmark ruling under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UN Class OS. That decision struck down China's sweeping 9-line claim, declaring it had no basis in international law. More importantly, the tribunal addressed features like sandy cay, identifying it as a low-tide elevation and therefore not entitled to its own maritime entitlements. The ruling placed sandy cay squarely under the jurisdiction of the Philippines' Thitu Island, Pagasa, which sits well inside Manila's exclusive economic zone, EEZ. For Manila, the ruling was a powerful legal weapon, proof that its sovereignty was not just a matter of nationalist rhetoric, but firmly backed by international law. For Beijing, however, the decision was dismissed as null and void, a ruling it has consistently ignored while pressing its claims through force and persistence. That persistence comes in the form of what analysts call gray zone tactics, China's preferred method of creeping control without triggering outright war. Instead of using its navy openly, Beijing deploys its China Coast Guard and a shadowy network of maritime militia vessels to harass, intimidate, and block other nations' ships. These tactics fall below the threshold of armed conflict, but they achieve what Beijing wants: incremental, salami-sliced gains. Over time, reefs are occupied, fishing grounds are restricted, and access is quietly denied. Sandy Key is the latest chapter in this playbook. By landing Coast Guard personnel and raising a flag, then retreating under the cover of ambiguity, China is testing how far it can push without triggering a direct military response. It's a strategy of pressure, provocation, and patience, one designed to wear down smaller nations like the Philippines, while reshaping the reality at sea to Beijing's advantage. Every new provocation at Sandy Key is not an isolated incident. It is a direct challenge to Philippine sovereignty. Each time Chinese personnel step foot on the sandbank or raise a flag, it chips away at Manila's de facto control of the feature and undermines the Philippines' hard-won legal standing from the 2016 arbitral ruling. Sovereignty is not only defended in courtrooms or diplomatic halls, it is exercised by presence, patrols, and the ability to use and protect one's territory. If Sandy Key gradually slips under China's shadow, it sets a dangerous precedent that even clear international law and tribunal rulings can be ignored, leaving Manila's claims as paper victories eroded by facts on the ground. For the Philippines, this makes defending Sandy Key not just a tactical issue, but a test of national resolve. The economic implications are equally pressing. For Filipino fishermen, Sandy Key and the waters surrounding Thitu Island have been a traditional lifeline, providing both food and livelihood. But as Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels increase their patrols, Filipino boats are harassed, blocked, or forced to retreat. This restricts access to vital fishing grounds, directly impacting local economies in Palawan and coastal provinces that depend on the West Philippine Sea. The broader picture is even starker. A 2021 study by the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research estimated that a major conflict in the South China Sea could wipe out 10 to 33% of GDP for frontline states like the Philippines. Even without full-scale war, the uncertainty generated by repeated confrontations raises insurance costs for shipping, discourages investment, and creates instability in sectors tied to maritime resources. In short, Sandy Key is not just a symbolic sandbank. It is tied to the economic security of millions of Filipinos.
Geopolitically, provocations at Sandy Cay could become a spark in an already volatile regional landscape. The South China Sea is crowded not just with Filipino and Chinese vessels, but also with U.S. warships, Australian patrols, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, and increasing European naval visits. A confrontation here, especially one involving water cannons, collisions, or another attempt at a flag-raising stunt, could quickly draw in external powers. For Washington, which has repeatedly affirmed that the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to armed attacks on Philippine vessels in the West Philippine Sea, a Chinese escalation at Sandy Cay is a potential trigger point. For Beijing, the presence of US and allied forces so close to its claimed territory is intolerable, pushing it to respond with more patrols and aggressive maneuvers. The result is a tightening spiral where each move and countermove risks miscalculation. What begins as a small provocation on a sandbank could quickly become a regional crisis, testing alliances, international law, and the fragile balance of peace in the Indo-Pacific. Under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines has pivoted to a new and more proactive approach in confronting China's provocations at sea. Unlike past administrations that often practiced strategic ambiguity, downplaying incidents in hopes of quiet diplomacy, Marcos has embraced what his officials call assertive transparency. This means openly documenting and publicizing Chinese coercive actions instead of keeping them behind closed doors. When Philippine vessels are hit by water cannons, blocked by swarms of maritime militia, or sideswiped by Chinese cutters, the incidents are no longer whispered about in defense circles. They are released to the world through official videos, photographs, and press briefings. A case in point was the widely circulated footage of a China Coast Guard vessel blasting water cannons at a Philippine resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal. The Marcos administration made sure those images reached global media outlets, generating not only outrage, but also sympathy and diplomatic support for Manila. This transparency has reshaped the information battlefield, turning what used to be local skirmishes into global stories of David standing up to Goliath. Alongside this strategy of exposure, Marcos has doubled down on strengthening alliances. Where China sees courting outside powers, Manila sees building lifelines of security. Marcos has repeatedly framed the Philippines' position not as hostility toward China, but as a firm defense of sovereignty.
Did the China challenge come up in your conversation with the Indian leadership this time?
Yes, but very tangentially, because we are not here to bemoan whatever it is that China is doing, but really to again form that coalition. We are not against anyone. We are just for territory, the defense of our territory, the respect to the exercise of our sovereign right.
As he put it, we are not against anyone. We are just for territory. The defense of our territory, the respect to the exercise of our sovereign rights. This framing reinforces that the Philippines is acting out of necessity, not aggression. The results of this alliance strategy are visible in the rapid expansion of joint military drills. The 2024 Balikatan exercises were the largest in history, drawing over 16,000 service members from the Philippines, the United States, and a growing roster of partner nations including Australia, Japan, and France. Notably, drills have expanded to include live-fire anti-ship missile tests, amphibious landings in northern Luzon, and coordinated maritime patrols in the West Philippine Sea. These activities send a clear signal: Manila is no longer alone. It stands within a tightening network of security partners committed to deterring Chinese adventurism. At home, Marcos has pushed forward with military modernization at a scale not seen since the Cold War. Central to this is the Horizon 3 program, the third phase of the Armed Forces of the Philippines' long-term modernization strategy. With a projected budget of up to $35 billion over the next decade, the program is designed to transition the AFP from a primarily counterinsurgency force into a capable external defense institution. The focus includes acquiring modern offshore patrol vessels, multi-role fighter aircraft, advanced missile defense systems, and enhanced radar networks. For the first time in decades, the Philippines is not just talking about defending its waters, it is investing heavily in the means to do so. Already, Tokyo has pledged to supply long-range radar systems, the US is providing coastal defense missiles, and Manila has initiated contracts for new frigates and submarines. Together, these assets form the backbone of a strategy to ensure that provocations at Sandy Cay or elsewhere cannot simply go unanswered. In short, Marcos's strategy combines information warfare, alliance building, and modernization. By shining a light on China's actions, reinforcing its partnerships, and investing in hard power, the Philippines is signaling that it will not retreat into silence or weakness. The message is clear: Manila intends to defend its claims not only with legal arguments, but also with ships, soldiers, and a coalition of allies standing alongside it. Beijing has not remained idle in the face of Manila's new playbook of assertive transparency and alliance building. Instead, China has doubled down on its own repertoire of coercive tools, escalating its gray zone tactics while deploying economic, diplomatic, and information campaigns to counter the Philippines' growing defiance. For Beijing, Sandy Cay and the broader South China Sea are not simply disputed reefs. They are litmus tests of China's ability to project power, maintain prestige, and prevent smaller states from undermining its claim of indisputable sovereignty. Escalating gray zone tactics. In response to Manila's publicized resupply missions and alliance-driven exercises, China has increased the frequency, size, and aggressiveness of its deployments. Where once a handful of China Coast Guard cutters or maritime militia boats would patrol the shoals, swarms of vessels are appearing regularly, boxing in Philippine ships with dangerous maneuvers. Analysts note a sharp uptick in shouldering incidents, where Chinese ships deliberately ram or bump Filipino vessels, as well as the sustained use of water cannons, military-grade lasers, and even acoustic weapons to harass crews without technically crossing the line into open warfare. Each of these actions is calibrated to exhaust the Philippines, erode its physical access to its own exclusive economic zone, EEZ, and test the credibility of its alliance with the United States. Sandy Cay, in particular, has become a focal point of this strategy, with Chinese vessels conducting nearly daily patrols since April 2025, when Chinese personnel briefly attempted to raise a flag on the sandbank. The message is blunt. Beijing will not yield an inch, even as Manila raises its own visibility on the global stage. Information warfare and diplomatic protests. Alongside physical coercion at sea, China has intensified its narrative warfare. State-controlled outlets like the Global Times and Xinhua regularly describe the Philippines as a pawn of the United States, accusing Manila of inviting instability into the region. The rhetoric is sharp, often tinged with nationalistic idioms meant to portray the Philippines as weak and manipulated. Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials have dismissed the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling outright, reiterating Beijing's long-held position. As one foreign ministry spokesperson declared, the so-called arbitral award is illegal, null, and void, and has no binding force. China neither accepts nor recognizes it. These statements are accompanied by a steady stream of diplomatic protests, with Beijing summoning Philippine envoys or issuing stern demarches whenever Manila publicizes new incidents. For Beijing, shaping international perception is as important as controlling shoals. The goal is to frame Manila as the provocateur, not the victim. Perhaps the most potent but less visible tool in China's arsenal is economic leverage. Beijing has a history of weaponizing trade and investment against Manila during periods of heightened tension. A notable case came in 2012, after the Scarborough Shoal standoff, when China imposed stricter phytosanitary standards on Philippine bananas and mangoes, effectively cutting exports and inflicting significant losses on Filipino farmers. This form of coercion, often subtle and bureaucratic, allows Beijing to punish Manila without firing a shot. Similar patterns have re-emerged in recent years. Chinese tourism, which once accounted for over 1 million annual visitors to the Philippines, has quietly dipped amid diplomatic flare-ups. More recently, business leaders have expressed concern that escalations over Sandy Cay could once again target Philippine agricultural exports, manufacturing supply chains, or even delay major Chinese-backed infrastructure projects in Manila. While China rarely admits these measures are political, the timing often aligns with periods of maritime confrontation, suggesting a deliberate attempt to create economic pain that weakens domestic support for Manila's defiant stance. Taken together, these countermeasures form a comprehensive Chinese strategy. Pressure Manila at sea through gray zone coercion, undermine it diplomatically by branding it a pawn of outsiders, and squeeze it economically to sow hesitation among Philippine elites. For Beijing, the objective is not just to hold Sandy Cay, but to teach Manila a lesson, that defiance carries costs, and sovereignty comes second to China's regional ambitions.
The struggle over Sandy Cay is not a passing skirmish. It is the front line in a much larger battle for control over the South China Sea. For the Philippines, every resupply mission, every documented incident, and every unfurled flag is an assertion of its sovereign rights under international law. For China, each gray zone maneuver is a reminder that it will not abandon its sweeping territorial claims. This push and pull creates a tense equilibrium, one where sovereignty is defended not by dramatic battles, but by daily acts of resistance and resilience. Sandy Cay, though just a sandbank, has become a powerful symbol. Whoever controls it signals control over the broader strategic contest. The Marcos administration has elevated this once overlooked feature into a litmus test of the Philippines' willpower, transforming it into a proxy battlefield of narratives, laws, and ships.
Yet the danger of escalation is never far away. The growing density of vessels, Philippine Coast Guard cutters, Chinese Coast Guard ships, militia swarms, and even naval escorts means the margin for error is razor thin. A sudden collision, an unplanned ramming, or even a single water cannon burst aimed too high could spark injuries or fatalities. Once blood is spilled, domestic political pressures on both sides would make de-escalation far more difficult. Analysts warn that Sandy Cay is the perfect environment for a miscalculation crisis. Small vessels operating in close quarters, crews under immense stress, nationalist politics at home, and global powers watching closely. In such a scenario, what begins as a routine provocation could quickly spiral into an international flashpoint, drawing in US and allied forces through security treaties and mutual defense commitments. Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, and now Sandy Cay are not isolated disputes. They are tinderboxes where a single spark could light the region. Looking ahead, the Marcos administration faces one of the greatest strategic tests of its time: how to sustain its assertive transparency strategy without tipping into open confrontation. Manila's decision to publicize Chinese coercion has already won it international sympathy and bolstered alliances. But sustaining momentum requires more than exposure. It requires credible deterrence. Continuous military modernization under the Rehorizon 3 program is critical to ensure the Philippines has the tools to enforce its sovereignty, protect its fishermen, and withstand Chinese intimidation. At the same time, Manila must work tirelessly to maintain a unified international coalition, ensuring that the 2016 arbitral ruling remains a living precedent rather than a forgotten document. Ultimately, the ability to deter and respond to the next provocation at Sandy Cay will be a defining moment, not only for the Marcos presidency, but for the future of international law in the South China Sea. If Manila can hold its ground, backed by allies and armed with both legal legitimacy and growing military capability, Sandy Cay may become more than a flashpoint. It may stand as proof that even the smallest state can resist the creeping shadow of coercion and preserve the principle that might not make right in one of the world's most contested waters. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
Imagine the flashpoint. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel fires water cannons at a Philippine supply boat near Second Thomas Shoal. Manila responds. Shots are fired. The question that follows is not just military. It is geopolitical. It reshapes every alliance, every trade route, and every strategic calculation across the Indo-Pacific. A China-Philippines conflict would not stay bilateral for long. The South China Sea carries roughly $3.4 trillion in annual trade. More than half of the world's maritime freight tonnage passes through these waters. Beneath them lie an estimated 125 billion barrels of oil and 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The sea is not a peripheral waterway. It is the economic circulatory system of the Asia-Pacific. China claims roughly 90% of the South China Sea through through its so-called 9-dash line, a claim the Permanent Court of Arbitration rejected in 2016, calling it incompatible with international law. Beijing ignored the ruling. Manila accepted it. That legal and strategic standoff has never been resolved. It has only intensified. The real question today is this: if armed conflict erupts between China and the Philippines, which countries would actually stand with Manila and how far would they go? The answer starts in Washington. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines is the cornerstone of Manila's security architecture. Article 4 of the treaty commits both parties to act against armed attacks in the Pacific, including attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft in the South China Sea. In 2023, Secretary of State Antony Blinken reaffirmed that the treaty applies to the South China Sea. That was not a minor diplomatic footnote. It was a strategic signal to Beijing: attack the Philippines, and the United States will respond.
That's why we stand with the Philippines and stand by our ironclad defense commitments, including under the Mutual Defense Treaty. Article 4 extends to armed attacks on the Filipino armed forces, public vessels, aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea.
Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the United States now has access to 9 military bases in the Philippines, up from 5 in 2023. 4 of those bases are in Luzon, the island closest to Taiwan. That proximity matters enormously. The Philippines is not just a treaty ally, it is a strategic platform. In a conflict scenario, U.S. support would likely include intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, air and naval power projection, logistics and resupply operations, and potentially direct military intervention depending on the nature and scale of Chinese action. The United States would not enter lightly, but it would enter. As Admiral John Aquilino, former commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, stated plainly, "The threat is the most dangerous we've seen since World War II." Washington understands the stakes. The Philippines is not a peripheral concern. It is central to U.S. strategy in the Western Pacific. Japan would not send fighter jets to dogfight over the Spratly Islands. Its constitution and domestic politics make combat deployment politically untenable in the short term. But to dismiss Japan as a bystander would be a serious analytical error. Tokyo and Manila have deepened their defense ties substantially over the past 3 years. In 2024, Japan signed a reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, the first Japan has signed with a Southeast Asian country. Japanese Coast Guard vessels have conducted joint patrols with their Philippine counterparts. Tokyo has transferred radar systems, patrol vessels, and defense equipment under its official security assistance framework. Japan's strategic logic is straightforward and self-interested. China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea does not stop there. The same assertiveness that threatens Philippine sovereignty in the Spratlys also threatens Japan's southwestern island chain, including the Senkaku Islands. For Tokyo, the South China Sea is not someone else's problem. It is a preview of its own. In a conflict, Japan would almost certainly provide intelligence sharing, logistical support, radar and surveillance data, Coast Guard assets, and economic assistance to Manila. Diplomatically, Tokyo would work to internationalize the crisis, bring it to the United Nations Security Council, and mobilize G7 condemnation. That is not nothing. That is substantial strategic weight applied through non-combat means. Australia's strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific has shifted dramatically since 2021. The AUKUS partnership, bringing together Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, is a generational commitment to reshaping the regional balance of naval power. Canberra is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. It is deepening defense integration with Washington at every level. Australia has also expanded direct engagement with the Philippines. Joint maritime patrols, military exercises, and defense cooperation agreements have all increased. Canberra understands that a Chinese-controlled South China Sea would fundamentally compromise Australia's northern maritime approaches and its access to critical trade routes. In a conflict scenario, Australian support would likely be substantial. naval deployments alongside US forces, intelligence sharing through the Five Eyes network, air support, and logistics are all plausible contributions. Australia would not act unilaterally, but as part of a US-led coalition, it would be among the most capable and committed participants. The Anzu Treaty also matters here. Under Article 4, an attack on the armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft of either party in the Pacific would trigger consultations and collective response. Australia's obligations are real, not merely rhetorical. South Korea presents a study in constrained partnership. Seoul is a significant arms exporter. Its KF-21 fighter and FA-50 light combat aircraft are actively marketed to Manila, and a country that understands Chinese coercion from its own experience. But South Korea has an existential problem sitting on its northern border. North Korea consumes Seoul's strategic bandwidth. Direct military deployment to the South China Sea is unlikely. Logistics, equipment, and intelligence support are more probable. Vietnam is the most interesting case in Southeast Asia. Hanoi has its own bitter territorial disputes with China, the Piracy Islands, the Spratlys, and a long history of Chinese aggression going back centuries. In 1974, China seized the Paracels by force from South Vietnam. In 1988, Chinese forces killed 64 Vietnamese sailors in a naval engagement at Johnson South Reef. The memory runs deep. Vietnam's four-nose policy, no military alliances, no foreign bases, no alignment with one country against another, no use or threat of force, formally constrains its options. But strategic autonomy and quiet balancing are not the same as passivity. Vietnam would likely share intelligence, coordinate diplomatically, and apply independent pressure on China in contested areas. It would not fight alongside Manila. But it would make Beijing's strategic calculus more complicated. Singapore punches far above its weight class militarily. Its armed forces are among the most capable in Southeast Asia. It hosts a substantial U.S. naval presence at Changi Naval Base, where American aircraft carriers routinely dock. But Singapore's foreign policy is built on a foundational principle: do not be forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. In a conflict, Singapore would provide indirect support, port access for U.S. and allied vessels, logistical facilitation, and quiet diplomatic engagement. It would not join combat operations. But strategic geography makes Singapore's cooperation important regardless of formal commitments. Indonesia is a different calculation entirely. Jakarta controls the Malacca Strait, the Lombok Strait, and the Sunda Strait, the three most critical maritime choke points connecting the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In 2019 and 2020, Indonesia deployed naval vessels to the North Natuna Sea after Chinese Coast Guard ships repeatedly intruded into its exclusive economic zone. Jakarta called them out directly, unlike many Asian members who avoid confrontation. But Indonesia is also Asia's largest economy, a self-proclaimed non-aligned power, and deeply reluctant to be drawn into great power competition. Its support in a conflict would be diplomatic and humanitarian, not military. Malaysia is similar. It has quiet South China Sea disputes of its own with China, but economic ties with Beijing constrain its public posture. India's role would be defined by strategic geography more than formal alliance. New Delhi is not a treaty ally of Manila. It has no obligation to fight. But India is a Quad partner, alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia, and it views Chinese maritime expansion through a lens shaped by its own ongoing border tensions with Beijing. The 2020 Galwan Valley clash, where Indian and Chinese soldiers fought in hand-to-hand combat along the line of actual control, sharpened Indian strategic thinking considerably. New Delhi has since accelerated defense cooperation across the Indo-Pacific, including arms sales to the Philippines. Manila has acquired BrahMos supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, a joint India-Russia development, which significantly enhances Philippine deterrence capability against Chinese naval assets. In a conflict scenario, India would likely maintain naval presence in the Indian Ocean to monitor and complicate Chinese logistics, provide diplomatic backing and intelligence, and deepen economic engagement with Manila. Direct intervention would remain off the table. But India's strategic shadow over the Indian Ocean, through which Chinese supply lines must pass, gives New Delhi considerable leverage without firing a single shot. Taiwan's position is the most paradoxical in this entire analysis. Taipei would almost certainly support Manila's cause intellectually, strategically, and perhaps through intelligence channels. Shared anxiety about Chinese military aggression creates natural alignment. Both Taiwan and the Philippines watch the same adversary conduct the same pattern of incremental coercion. But Taiwan cannot act openly. Its own survival is the first-order strategic priority. Any overt support from Manila would invite accelerated pressure from Beijing. Taiwan's contribution would remain in the shadows, intelligence sharing, diplomatic signaling, and the simple strategic fact that any Chinese military operation against the Philippines would risk exposing Taiwan to reduced Chinese surveillance and force attention. There is a harder point here. Taiwan's own situation informs how every actor in the region reads a China-Philippines conflict. If Beijing can coerce Manila into submission without triggering a meaningful allied response, the lesson for Taiwan, and for every country watching, is that the United States does not honor its commitments. The credibility of deterrence across the entire Indo-Pacific would be at stake. If a China-Philippines conflict materialized, the Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India would likely become the most important strategic coordination platform in the Indo-Pacific. Not a formal alliance. Not a military command structure, but a framework for intelligence fusion, diplomatic messaging, economic pressure, and strategic signaling. The Quad's value is precisely its informality. It creates coordination without the treaty obligations that might deter participation. Japan can contribute without deploying combat troops. India can signal without triggering its own confrontation with China. Australia and the United States can lead without appearing to act unilaterally. In 2023, Quad leaders issued a joint statement condemning destabilizing and coercive actions in the South China Sea, language that would acquire operational meaning in a conflict scenario. The Quad is not a paper tiger. It is a coalition